slumbering. His life pregnant slumbering. It stopped, never to go again. When the old man died.
Dancing in the dark till the tune ends. We're dancing in the dark, and it soon ends. We're waltzing in the wonder of why we're here. Time hurries by, we're here and gone, looking for the light of a new love to brighten up the night. I have you, love, and we can face the music together, dancing in the dark. What though love is old, what though song is old, through them we can be young. Hear this heart of mine, make yours part of mine, dear one. Tell me that we're waltzing in the wonder of why we're here. Time hurries by, we're here and gone. And we can face the music together, dancing in the dark.
Grandfather's Collage by the Edison Quartet.
My grandfather's clock was too large for the shelf, so it stood 19 years on the floor. It was taller by half than the old man himself, so it weighed not a
Why is this house, unlike any other building in the Audubon Park Historic District, included in the designation? And why are these apartment buildings so like the other buildings in the district? Why have they not been included? Distorting completely the history of an area that first was a farm, then contained individual villas, and then row houses, and then apartments built at the beginning of the 20th century. Good afternoon, everyone. Essentially, what this afternoon's discussion is about is how it is that the Landmarks Preservation Commission came to a neighborhood, Audubon Park, which was diverse and complex and attempted to flatten it out and to distort its history into something that was more narrowly focused. And so they have only included early 20th century apartment houses that are 6 to 12 stories and one house from that same time period. What we're looking at is the oldest house in this community, the oldest inhabited house in all of Upper Manhattan. And this building, which dates from 1851, in addition to that, to being the oldest house, it is also a house which exemplifies the sort of initial development that was done even during Audubon's lifetime on his estate, Minnie's Land, where his sons built houses, not unlike this villa, which was built in 1851, the same year that he died.
My grandfather's clock was too large for the shelf, so it stood 19 years on the floor. It was taller by half than the old man himself, though it weighed not a penny weight more. It was built on the morn of the day that he was born, and was always his treasure and pride. But it stopped, never to go again, when the old man died.
The question is, why were apartment buildings in front of me or to the right of me, which date from the same time period and which were built using the same architects and developers, why were they excluded from the historic district? And why were houses that were built after this house and just before these apartment buildings, why were they all excluded from a district to try to make or to try to convey a history that never was, a history which is now far more banal and inauthentic in terms of the reality of the great diversity of architecture and culture and history that represents Audubon Park. An economic irony of these apartment buildings in Audubon Park is how the developers built them right out to the lot line, following the curve of Boulevard Lafayette and the curve of Riverside Drive. And as a consequence, you have concave and convex facades following the roadway to allow for extra interior space in the buildings, more rentable space that creates a greater distinction in terms of the facades of these buildings, which otherwise would be more mundane. It's been said that perfection is no detail, but details make for perfection. And that's certainly true here in Audubon Park, where one whimsical or charming detail after another delights the eye. And the great irony is that usually these weren't specially designed, but were available from the catalog of a terracotta manufacturer or of a stone carving firm.
Dancing in the dark till the tune ends. We're dancing in the dark, and it soon ends. We're waltzing in the wonder of why we're here. Time hurries by, we're here and gone, looking for the light of a new love to brighten up the night. I have you, love, and we can face the music together, dancing in the dark.
Perched on a hillside here on 158th Street with magnificent river views from the backs of the houses through oriel windows and balconies, this wonderful row, this inventive ensemble designed by John P. Leo, a local architect, has wonderful details from beautiful hand-wrought ironwork to wonderful spandrels below the windows. And all of this charming architecture is threatened by not being protected as part of the Audubon Park Historic District. And these houses, the finest row house group to remain in Audubon Park, ought to be protected to fully represent the complexity of its history from farm to apartment houses.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here and to participate in this informative panel that is put on by Harlem One Stop in their series Hidden in Plain Sight, which examines various aspects of the architecture and history of the city, which we see every day, but which we don't really see. Today, in discussing Audubon Park, we begin with my wonderful friend, Matthew Spady, who has written the definitive work on Audubon Park, The Neighborhood Manhattan Forgot, Audubon Park. Matthew has been a dedicated voice crying in the wilderness. Just after my wonderful friend Carolyn Kent, who started the Landmarks Committee at Community Board 9, initiated efforts to have an historic district created in Audubon Park back in the mid-1990s. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Matthew.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks to you and Ewan for inviting me to participate in the conversation. And of course, thanks to all of our audience for tuning in today. So the interlocking Audubon Park and Audubon Terrace historic districts sit on land that was once John James Audubon's farm, Minnie's land. He and his family moved to a 14-acre tract at 155th Street in the spring of 1842, and they were living there in 1851 when Audubon died. On the screen on the left there, you can see a map of Minnie's land on the left and an image of Audubon's house on the right in the Italianate villa style. Now, despite the success of the Birds of America, the Audubons were never financially stable, and within months of Audubon's death, his wife Lucy and his sons Victor and John sold the eastern part of their farm to Dennis Harris, and my colleague Joe will be telling you a lot more about him later in today's presentation. So they sold that to Dennis Harris, and then they began developing the western part with a series of Italianate villas nestled into the topography. By 1854, just 3 years after Audubon's death, the farm Minnie's land had given away to suburban Audubon Park. So let's look now at Audubon Park on the next slide. As you can see, it had about a dozen villas on large lots. They were scattered among gardens and forest trees and winding drives. And of course, not Minnie's land any longer. This was called Audubon Park. Interestingly, if you look there on the on the eastern side of what is now Broadway, you can see that while Audubon Park was trending in one direction, the corresponding blocks to the east, which Dennis Harris was developing, were beginning to adapt to the grid with similar sized houses set on 25-foot wide lots oriented to the numbered streets. Those contrasting trends would continue throughout the remainder of the 19th century. Between 1854, when Audubon Park's name first came to the fore, and the American Civil War, no one family had controlling interest there, but that changed in 1864 when George Blake Grinnell bought the house he had been leasing in the center of the park, the Hemlocks, and you can see that on the upper part of the slide there. That's a later version of it from about 1890 after extensive modifications. After he bought that house, he began expanding his empire. As we'll see on the next slide, by the time he died in 1891, he owned most of the eastern two-thirds of the park, which his surviving children inherited in 1893 after their mother died. Now, the Grinnells, just as the Audubons, And we can move on to the next slide now. There we go. The Grinnell family found themselves much in the same position the Audubons had 50 years earlier. They had plenty of land, they had houses, but they weren't producing sufficient income to offset costs. So like the Audubons, they began selling off their land and their houses. Two public improvements really helped them along with that. One was the arrival of the New York subway system. There on the lower right-hand side, you can see the kiosks where the subway arrived, or where the subway entrances were at 157th Street. That's from 1905, just a few months after the subway opened. The other public improvement that helped the Grinnells was the extension of Riverside Drive from Grant's Tomb to connect with the Boulevard Lafayette at 158th. In the summer of 1908, the Grinnells sold most of what they had left in Audubon Park. And by the summer of 1911, just a few years later, Beaux-Arts apartment houses and the beginnings of the Audubon Terrace Museum complex covered most of what they had owned. An eventual casualty of this development was the old Audubon homestead, which you can see there at the bottom left, with the Riverside Drive viaduct right at its back. It gave way to a second wave of development and disappeared from the streetscape in 1932. By then, the Audubon Park name had all but disappeared from common use. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we'll move really quickly into the 20th century, actually 21st century. The Audubon Park name began making a comeback in the early years of the century when my neighbor John Esmond and I wrote and submitted a request for evaluation to the Landmarks Preservation Commission, asking for historic district status. At the same time, we then began promoting the idea in the neighborhood, and as I say, the Audubon Park name began to come back. Our RFE encompassed mostly the Beaux-Arts apartment houses east of Riverside Drive. However, Community Board 12's Land Use Committee, under the leadership of my neighbor Wayne Benjamin, suggested expanding that area to include all of the buildings in the original Audubon Park footprint, which was from 155th to 158th west of Broadway, as well as all of the buildings on either side of Riverside Drive as far north as 162nd Street, making a much larger historic district than we had initially suggested. As you can see from the map, LPC's 2009 designation for the Audubon Park Historic District included all of the buildings in our original RFE, as well as a few of those that CB12 had suggested, but they omitted the row houses on 158th Street, which have a buildable but currently inaccessible lot behind them. And again, my neighbor and friend Vivian Ducat will tell you more about that later in our presentation. So excepting the Sutherland and the Lafayette on the eastern side of Riverside Drive, none of the buildings between 158th and 167th Street were included. Looking at this map last night, it suddenly occurred to me that while I was finalizing the presentation, that the Audubon Park Historic District actually looks like it was gerrymandered. It adheres not to the Audubon Park footprint, not that historical footprint, nor did the expansion really have any sort of logical, architectural, cultural, or historical logic. And as a result of those omissions, as we'll be discussing today in this presentation, for several years now, the neighborhood around Audubon Park has been under siege from developers. So thank you, Michael. That's a sort of introduction to the Audubon Park Historic District, and I'll turn it back to you.
Oh, well, thank you, Matthew. That was wonderful. Vivian Ducat is a long-term resident of Audubon Park, and she was trained as a journalist with the BBC and has produced productions for institutions like the Museum of the City of New York, the New York Historical Society, and the Malcolm X Memorial at the Audubon Ballroom and Theater, and has focused considerable energies to looking at the history of the houses that were built in the 1890s to designs by John P. Leo on West 158th Street. And she is going to enlighten us further about those houses now. Vivian.
Yes, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Ewan, for including me. I'm as much to tell you about, oh, here comes my video. there we go. Tell you about, as a tag from what Matthew was saying, these houses, speaking about developers coming here, in 2015, I noticed ads for three of them for being up for sale. And this is sort of our call to realizing that we had to do something about them. These houses, yes, are a different type form than both the apartment buildings that came later and the original villas, but they were built as a culture. I mean, if you look at it culturally, they were built in anticipation of the subway. 8 of them were built in 1898, which you see in the picture, and the other 4 up the block were built after that. We could look at the next picture. These are 3 ornate buildings. You can see these were there until these Orioles well, they're still there now, but they're plastered over with concrete, which you'll see later. There were speculative houses. They were built by a developer. Do you want to show all 3 of these images, Nidal? Yeah, so that's the middle of the block, which includes a couple of the buildings that actually were built that came later in the row. And then there's one more. One other image where you see that they look down toward the river. Apparently, until the 1980s, there was also what people call cobblestone, Belgian block that was in the street. It's now actually an exit off the highway on and off. So these are beautiful houses on a very trafficated street. If it's okay with you, Michael, just in terms of our experience with landmarks, I mean, there's cultural history as well as architectural history, as well as there's a lot to this block that we wanted to consider. One of them is that one of the houses belonged to a man named Reginald Pelham Bolton, who was this incredible polymath who invented rapid elevators for skyscrapers. He wrote the first and almost only history of Washington Heights. He did archaeology in northern Manhattan. He was on the first historic preservation commission for New York and had various other jobs in government. And his son, Guy Bolton, actually wrote 50 musicals, including Anything Goes with Cole Porter. And one of the things that was really amazing that he did, which really actually plays into the upcoming history, is that Bolton created this garden. If we can have a picture of it, behind 8 of the houses. He took down the fences and convinced the owners to create this beautiful oasis in the back. There's also another shot of it. I found a file that included these newspaper articles from the 30s about how this is an oasis in the midst of this developing Manhattan all around it. There's another picture, Nidala, where you see benches. They had a platform for theatricals. It was a real kind of little gem, but it is its downfall because there is this big space behind the houses that's still there now. And when developers look at it, they see potential. All they need to do is knock down one of the row houses and to give access to this locked in space, and they have the ability, if they were allowed to build a relatively large building. That's been part of the reason why we are so compelled to landmark them, though we wrote 2 different letters and a request for examination to landmarks. We're told they were not of the same typology of the neighborhood. They were not the best examples of the architectural style. They were that there was a loading dock across the street. Robert A.M. Stern wrote 2 letters for us. I mean, we mounted this effort in 2015 and 2016. We were awarded for our efforts with a 6 to celebrate from the Historic Districts Council. And we have to date not been successful. There's also another history of an educated African-American community of fellow graduates of Lincoln University who came to live together on this street. And am I going on too long, Michael? If I am, I'll stop. But there was a community here in the 60s, 70s, 80s that also was another phase of who lived here and kind of the life of this block. And in our opinion, in my opinion, it's not only about architecture, it's about community when you're landmarking, about who lived here and what culture was shared. I'm happy to move on in fear of not going on too long, to throw it back to you, Michael, to go on to our house of also a different typology around the corner at 857 Riverside Drive.
Well, thank you so much, Vivian. That was really enlightening and gives people, I think, an idea of just what it's like to deal with bureaucracy in New York City. Finally, we have Joseph Amodio, who is a freelance journalist, preoccupied with the creative, with the arts and fashion and food, and who is a graduate of Brown University and who has worked for Condé Nast and other wonderful media giants. And he has led been at the forefront, leading the battle to save this very house, the oldest house to survive, not just in Audubon Park, but the oldest inhabited house in all of Upper Manhattan, and that's number 857 Riverside Drive. So, Joseph, if you kindly begin with your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Michael. I live here in Washington Heights, and I have passed by 857 Riverside many times, and I've always thought it's a curious house, a one that stands out, that it feels like, you know, when you look at the block, one of these things is not like the other, and 857 Riverside is that thing. And what pulled me into this fight were two things, really, a photo and a story. And Nidal, I think you have the photo there. The photo was taken by the esteemed photographer Bernice Abbott in 1937, who was going around Washington Heights and taking pictures of old buildings from the 1800s that she felt sure were about to be demolished. And in fact, all of them were, except for this one. And you just look at it, and it's just irresistible, with the little cupola and the wraparound porch. When I first saw it, I felt like a character in that novel Time and Again, going back into the past and falling in love. The story that I heard connected with the house is a bit uglier, but it pulled me in. That took place downtown on a lovely fall day in 1846, when people were milling about in City Hall Park, and a black man came racing through the park, running for his life, chased by a rabid mob. And unfortunately, now we know the kind of, we know all too well the kind of firestorm that a mob can bring. He dashed across the park, ran down a side street, and slipped into a pie shop, where he was able to elude the crowd and get up to the Anti-Slavery Society offices, which was one of the leading abolitionist groups of the day. And they immediately hid him under the floorboards and then said, now what? The mayor had sent the police force out to look for this man. His name was George Kirk. He was an escaped slave who had stowed away on a brig out of Savannah, and it had docked in New York. But New York was not a hospitable place for escaping slaves, sad to say. And there were crowds who were obviously searching for him. So the group decided to reach out to this man named Dennis Harris, who was a sugar refiner, a fiery Methodist preacher, and a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And they devised this plan whereby Harris sent his wagon over to the offices, and they loaded it up with crates and boxes. And inside one of these boxes was George Kirk. It's maybe not the best plan in the world. There were cops that were stationed outside the offices. They're not complete idiots. They saw what was going on. They said, I don't know, something's obviously worth investigating. They stopped the wagon. They broke open the boxes, and they found George Kirk. That moment was characterized in newspaper accounts of the day, and also this political cartoon, which depicts in rather shocking, sort of racist imagery the event that happened, and the policeman pulling him out of the crate, spewing racial epithets at the time. When I first read about this, all I could think was this is one of the earliest cases of a Black Lives Matter moment. It's got all the earmarks of Black Lives Matter except for the cell phones. The name of Dennis Harris, you can see on the wagon. He was known at the time to be an abolitionist, as I said, and though his Underground Railroad activities were more clandestine. But the events of that day, basically, just to assure you, George Kirk was dragged off to jail, but he was eventually released by a sympathetic judge, and he was spirited off to Canada by members of the Underground Railroad. But this story fascinated me, and I wanted to know more. Who was this man, Dennis Harris, and his connection to this house? Because what I learned early on is that he built the house at 857 Riverside. He owned it for a few years, and then sold it to his good friend and fellow abolitionist, a judge named John Newhouse. And their vision for what Washington Heights could be was rather astounding. They each moved their families up to Washington Heights at a time when Washington Heights was just orchards and cow pastures and a bucolic rural area well north of the city. But they saw that it could be something else. And so Harris started building houses like this one here that would eventually be at 857 Riverside. This drawing depicts the house with the wraparound porch, a barn in back, and Riverside didn't exist at this point. You accessed the house from this winding carriage path that led to what would later be called Broadway. And it was on 3 acres of rolling hillside that overlooked the Hudson. This was just one of the houses that Harris had built. He became sort of a land speculator, and he started building houses and more. He and Newhouse built up a sugar refinery, which would be the next picture in the doll, a sugar refinery on the Hudson at around 160th Street, along with a wharf at 158th Street. And they had a steamboat, which would ferry passengers from downtown New York to 158th Street and on up to Poughkeepsie. That was a huge economic boon to the neighborhood, and they ended up building a tenement house to house workers and their families. But again, they had not lost their abolitionist zeal. That was still very important to them too. And so they helped erect 2 churches. One moved around a bit, but wound up on the corner of Amsterdam and 155th Street, what became the Washington Heights Congregational Church, which was also fiercely anti-slavery at the time. Dennis Harris was, besides being a sugar refiner, was a minister, and he preached fiery sermons about the ills of slavery. And he gathered a congregation of people from the area who were interested in hearing about this at a time when most New Yorkers weren't, which is something that, as I looked into the history, was, I think, the most shocking thing that we think of New York as sort of bluer than blue. But at the time, slavery was a dirty word and a messy proposition, and nobody really wanted to talk about it. So people like Dennis Harris and John Newhouse, who were putting these stories out there, who were having abolitionists come to the church and speak to their neighbors about the firestorm that was about to overtake the nation, and having escaped slaves as well come and speak to the congregation, African Americans. This was not common at the time. This was not done. And it speaks to the courage of these two men who are pretty much all but forgotten. All of the landmarks that once existed that could tell the story of these people, the sugar refinery, the steamboat, the wharf, the tenement house, the churches, and all the other houses that Harris helped to build, they're all gone now. And the only structure that exists is this one little house, 857 Riverside, which is not quite the way it looked in its prime, but neither are any of us. And it is, to my mind, the only structure we have that tells the story of two men and this very unusual abolitionist community that existed up here in Washington Heights and that has never been talked about before. If you go on to the Landmarks Commission website, and you can see a great deal of work that they've done to highlight the abolitionist activity that took place in New York in the antebellum period, you will see several houses connected with abolitionists, none of them uptown. They're all mostly in downtown Manhattan and Brooklyn. None of them are above 29th Street. So to think that there was actually abolitionist activity going on up here in Washington Heights and in uptown New York, in an area that would become known for its communities of color, I think is notable and needs to be remembered. And that's what we're hoping to do today.
Thank you so much. That was really just so dynamic and serves, as all of your presentations have, to underline the true importance of historic preservation, how by having these buildings that connect us to the past, we are able to appreciate history and what has gone before in a far more accessible way than if all of these buildings which embody our illustrious past are allowed to disappear. And I think that you're quite correct, Joseph, when you talk about how anomalous Mr. Harris and his colleagues were, because what's important to recall is how New York was so heavily invested in the antebellum South, and quite literally so that Brooks Brothers made much of its profits from providing slave cloth for clothes for enslaved people. And all of the slaves themselves were insured by the New York insurance companies and financed by the New York banks, and mortgages were held on slaves by banks in New York. And indeed, the connection of commerce in New York and the antebellum South was so strong that the mayor of New York at the outbreak of the Civil War proposed that New York secede from the Union so that it could trade with both the North and the South. So in that same sort of spirit, we've got this eternal combat with the development community, which sees nothing as sacred and nothing as worthy of protecting and saving. And so before we begin with questions to the public, I'd like to ask all of you, what do you think we can do to better make the city government appreciate why it is imperative to save these buildings that once they are gone, they will never come back, and which are so important in terms of what they teach us about where we've been? And that's to everyone.
Are you speaking to us, the panelists, the audience?
I'm speaking to you, the panelists. Please. Vivian, your thoughts.
I think that the kind of perfection that Landmarks expects is not realistic in terms of not every community is filled with people who have the money to be able to keep every cupola and keep every porch on every house. And I think as long as there are both this perfectionist ideal and the idea that something, you know, might have been removed, or it's not the best example of that particular type, that's not what it's about. I mean, how many rows of houses do you have like that that are part of this unusual sort of suburban community up here? I mean, these are pieces of history that nobody knows, and they're still here. And as long as the neighborhood is also, I think that the forces of development are one of the greatest enemies against preserving the older houses that have, I mean, if you look at the commentary today in the New York Times on the article about 857 Riverside Drive, 50% of the people say, oh, well, yeah, but it's not such a nice house, it shouldn't be kept. And another sort of half of them are understanding that with amazing histories that all of these houses have, why should you let them be felled and have some anonymous building be put up in its place?
Agreed, Vivian. And I think one thing that we should keep in mind, particularly with the presentations we've done today, is wouldn't we love to have John James Audubon's house still in existence? And Reginald Pelham Bolton, who Vivian mentioned, lived on 158th Street, led the charge. This was long before historic preservation was sort of official and something that could be done. It really required individuals to step forward. And Bolton tried to do this, and they even moved the house to a location that the city gave to them. This was in 1932, location at about 164th Street, where there's now a little park. And the idea was to save the house and restore it to what it had been originally, because at the time they were trying to save it, it didn't look like it had originally looked. It had a mansard roof, it had these bay windows that weren't original, it had a different piazza on the western side. So, you know, think about just the irony that here we are trying to save Bolton's house, and Bolton had tried unsuccessfully to save Audubon's. As I said, they moved it to this new location, and then the paper trail stops. More than likely what happened, this was the height of the Great Depression when they moved it. They were trying to raise money to restore it. Money didn't materialize. The house succumbed to vandals, the elements, souvenir seekers. In 1933, when it was moved there, it might have been taken apart and put into some Hooverville shacks.
The other issue that comes to mind for me is just the onslaught of history that, in a way, that we're fighting against. Because if you, I remember from Rick Burns' great series on the history of Manhattan, this city has always been a place of change and evolution and tearing things down and building up newer things, taller things, and that has, unfortunately, an interest in history has never been at the heart of most New Yorkers until very recently, I think, until the last few decades, really, where suddenly we have people who are, more conscious of these things. It strikes me that I just, for those who are in landmark commissions anywhere, my heart goes out to them. They are inundated with very fine stories and compelling arguments about countless buildings. And I'm sure it just is incredibly difficult to have to be the one sitting in the chair and making the decision, yes to this one, no to that one. And it's not a position I would want to be in. I'm quite happy to be, you know, holding a torch and saying, look at these incredible stories that I've, you know, discovered in the archives and by looking through old newspapers. You know, look at these dramatic stories and incredible tales of heroism from these men and women who lived in this house, and we should remember them. It's easier to tell that side of the story. But what I've been thinking about lately is how so many of these houses that used to exist are now gone, and there are so few of them in neighborhoods like ours that are very diverse, full of people of color, and that have been economically, sort of socioeconomically underprivileged for so long. And so I think for those folks who are in landmark commissions around the country who have their various sets of criteria that they use to try to make these tough decisions, I'm hoping that they are willing to be flexible with those sets of criteria, that they are willing to maybe reevaluate them and take into consideration the fact that when a request comes from a community such as ours, that the owners of the building just didn't have the funds to keep a cupola on top of a house that probably was just incredibly drafty and perhaps a security hazard in a community that had been ignored for so long from the city, and so didn't have the kind of safety protocols. It didn't have the kind of money that that you have on Park Avenue, where you wouldn't have to worry about security quite as much, perhaps. I'm just hoping that the more stories like ours get out there, the more that people in positions who are able to make these decisions will reevaluate those sets of criteria so that they understand that some folks who are in these houses just weren't equipped over the course of decades to keep up the houses in a pristine form.
Joe, sorry, Michael.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Good. If I could just tag on to that, because we also had a comment come in from someone from the audience that I was thinking about, and this person, Karen Davis in our audience, wrote, landmark preservation attracts mostly white middle-class professionals, and Washington Heights has become a neighborhood of working-class Blacks and Latinos. And I think one of the things that we need to remember is that back in the late 60s, into the 70s, into the 80s, when Landmarks Preservation Commission was created and was doing its earliest work, you needed advocates. You always need advocates for these buildings of these historic districts. And the advocates in Harlem and Washington Heights were more concerned about other things than preserving buildings in those years. They were trying to preserve lives. There were social issues that needed to be addressed. Consequently, north of 155th Street, unless I have counted wrong, there are 3 historic districts, only 3. Audubon Park, the one surrounding the Jamel Mansion, and the one that Mr. Tom's, I've forgotten the one up in Inwood. Vivian, you might remember the name for me.
There's a series of Tudor houses together.
Exactly.
And it's a very small part of Inwood. There's a lot more of Inwood that really needs to be preserved.
Exactly. It is just not possible that with the vast expanse of Washington Heights and Inwood, there are only 3 areas that are worthy of being historic districts. Another thing I'll add to that, The Audubon Park Historic District, one of the reasons that we went from request for evaluation to designation in less than a decade, which is fairly unusual, is because we're protection for the Audubon Terrace Historic District. We are a buffer around that historic district that prevents development taking place that would overshadow an existing which was created in 1979. Most of the earlier historic districts, or sorry, historic designations north of 155th Street were either something like the Church of the Intercession, which is at 155th, the Jamel Mansion, places, a couple of the churches, institutions that had someone who would speak up for them, but you did not have community members coming forward because, as I say, they were just busy worrying about other things. And now is the time for us to catch up, and LPC is the only one who can do that.
There's also an argument.
Landmark.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, Vivian. Continue, Vivian. Continue, Vivian.
Oh, I was just going to say that, in northern Manhattan, there are a lot more landmark-worthy buildings in some ways because developers, in their kind of racist idea, people would not have developed the way they did in the 20s on the Upper West Side. Once Harlem, what had become predominantly African-American, it's almost like it was seen as no economic value in order to build newer apartment buildings, deco, or before that, the 20s. And so in fact, you get a lot of Victorian architecture. You got a lot of interesting architecture in Upper Manhattan that you don't see anymore because there have been several iterations of buildings sort of south of 96th Street. So there's even a richer supply that should be preserved, if only to understand the progression of architecture in New York City.
Well, absolutely. And I've been remiss. I should have, from the very beginning, have offered up our thanks to John Freeman Gill for this penetrating examination of this one house on Riverside Drive that he did, that's in the New York Times this morning. And to further say, as is suggested in that article, that it's not just some accident that the mayor of the city of New York, in accordance with the enthusiasm for the Me Too movement, said that it's not just the police force of the city of New York which has been impacted by systemic racism. It is every department of the city government, and that includes the Landmarks Preservation Commission. There are far fewer districts and communities of color, even on Manhattan Island, so that in all of Harlem, in all of Upper Manhattan, there are something like 10% of the buildings are protected by landmarking, and Greenwich Village 2/3. And that is no accident. That is no accident. That was a policy which may not have been applied in some systematic way, but was just casually occurred because of people's lack of imagination that there was anything of value here. And one wonderful thing is that the Landmarks Commission has in the past, and looking at landmarks associated with African Americans, and has recognized that, yes, indeed, it is important to consider the economic status of communities in which they are doing designations. So that if one looks at the famous Strivers Row Historic District, there, when those places were designated, when those houses on those 2 blocks were designated, immediately following the designation, the city came forth with funding to offer grants to residents to do restoration work to their houses. It wasn't a complete and thorough restoration, but it was a restoration that took care of a lot of alterations that had occurred over time. And similarly, when the house that the great African-American inventor, Lewis Latimer, who both helped to perfect the electric light bulb working with Thomas Edison, and who helped to perfect the telephone working with Alexander Graham Bell. He designed a house for himself in Queens. And that house that he designed for himself over the years gradually was covered with aluminum siding and had its porch removed. And finally was actually, in order to save it, was actually moved off of its original location. But the commission designated it anyhow, recognizing that in doing so, that this would create an impetus that would allow for the restoration of the place. And this has occurred in other instances as well. It's occurred nearby on Sylvan Terrace, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But I wonder if you all would speak further on just what, in practical terms, we can do. One of the one member of the audience posed a question, or really a comment, saying how important it was to appeal to local elected officials. And that, of course, has been done. And I wonder if you all could announce who, beyond our wonderful Manhattan Borough President, Gail Brewer, who some of these people supporting your effort might be. Hello?
You're talking to us in terms of who we have appealed to.
Well, who have you successfully appealed to? Who, beyond Gail Brewer, has said that they're all for the historic district being expanded to include these buildings that were left out?
Oh, I mean, our Assemblyman Al Taylor, our State Senator Robert Jackson, our City Councilor Mark Levine, both for the 158th Street row as well as for 857 Riverside Drive, have been really active. And they in terms of 857, they've written a really strong letter together and got a really strong letter back from Landmarks, basically saying no, that they don't see that this building, this house, meets their specifications and requirements in order to be landmarked. And similarly, before, the phone calls even for Scott Stringer's public affairs person, Jessica Silver, appealed on behalf of 158th Street, Mark Levine, a couple of times, got letters back. I mean, it's not as if our locals aren't trying to help us. There is a very, I think the mayor's office is very pro-development and has been for the last two mayors. And I think Washington Heights is seen as kind of an inward, a last piece of land on this limited island where you can stick more buildings that look like Third Avenue or wherever. And that's part of the directive, that they're coming up with every excuse to tell us why it's not landmarkable. And I think a lot of that has to do with what it could be used for, as opposed to whether there's anything wrong or not worth saving for what there is here. So if that directive were to go away, in terms of let's leave it virgin for development, I think that our political support in our local officials, our community board has written resolutions in favor both of expanding the district when the original district was designated, in terms of adding then 158th Street, in terms of the house on Riverside Drive. It's not that we are not being supported, it's that there's a very strong pushback.
That said, then I wonder if it isn't time for us to host a candidates forum with all these many people running for mayor and running for Manhattan Borough President and running for council member, to be the council member for Washington Heights. If that mightn't be a good idea, what do you all think of that?
Well, I think we all need to reach out to everybody who's running for the various jobs, because one of the things they ought to do is to back the holding on to the cultural and not only the architectural, the sort of history of our neighborhood in its physical form. It's not as if New York is becoming colonial Williamsburg. I mean, even if you save building, it's interesting because I worked on a media project with Ken Jackson, and the New York City historian, Kenneth T. Jackson. One of the arguments he made was you should be careful. If you preserve too much of New York, suddenly we will become this sort of a dying city, and that since New York has this ongoing dynamic of always changing, we should be almost proud of the fact that we're always alive. And that might be true, but they don't have to both be in opposition to each other. We can save pieces of our past, particularly neighborhoods where nobody bothered to landmark, and we can be a dynamic city that grows in other ways. As we're changing now just because of the pandemic. So change is constant in New York, and that's not a reason not to save things.
Exactly.
Well, certainly one would not argue that Paris or London are dead because they have far greater historic preservation than we have here in New York, or Charleston, or Savannah for that matter.
Exactly. And as a graduate of William and Mary who lived for 4 years in Williamsburg, I can tell you New York is in no shape or form going to be like colonial Williamsburg, far beyond that. But I do think that it's important. I've seen several comments coming in here from the audience about, well, what's the value of this house? And Vivian, I think you mentioned that you'd seen some comments like that also to the article in the New York Times, that, it's just this yucky little old house. It doesn't look like it once did. It's an eyesore. Yeah, we do want to keep from having a 13-story apartment building there, which will be out of context with the buildings around it, but why this house? And I think that Joe gave, to me, a very moving presentation earlier, and stated exactly why we would want to save this house, because of not just what it represents architecturally, but what it represents historically and culturally. And Michael, you were quoted in John's article as saying, this could be the sort of place where you could take school children and say, look, right here in Manhattan, at a horrible time in our nation's history, there were people who were trying to do the right thing. Don't we need to have that today? Don't we need to have examples of where we can show there were people historically who were trying to do the right thing? And this is one chance that we have. Once this house is gone, there won't be others. Now, true, we cannot say, we do not have enough evidence to say this was a stop in the Underground Railroad. But we have enough evidence to be very convincing in saying that the man who built and owned this house was active in the Underground Railroad. This house was vacant. We have the records to show this house was vacant in the 2 years following the Fugitive Slave Act. So it is very, very logical that this house could have been used for those purposes. And we need to save it for those reasons, if for no other.
Well, Matthew, you might even express it the other way around, that given this man's history and the passion which he dedicated himself to the abolitionist movement, it would be absolutely unimaginable that he didn't utilize this property and any resources at his command,
right,
for the cause of the Underground Railroad. That's the sort of person that this was. And in talking about the future and how we redress the situation we are in today with our nation so divided, it takes common cause. And here was a man and his associate in a time when the Audubons, who had sold the property to him, they had both been slave owners. And at the Morris Jamel mansion, the Morrises and the Jamels were both slave owners. This is an example of the way forward, of how it is that working together, both to make the world a better place, both to save this landmark, that we can improve our city and improve our country.
And I would be remiss if we didn't remind folks out there who, if they want to work together too for this common cause, at the very least, they can go to stoptower857.org and sign on to the petition to show that this history and this idea of preservation is in fact important to them. I think not only the elected officials who are sort of already on the case here and sympathetic, and also the Landmark Commission, which I'm sure is struggling with a lot of different concerns, would find it very useful to know just how many people are out there who do think that this sort of cause is worth fighting for.
That is always what they look at. I mean, we brought hundreds of letters down to landmarks for the street, for 158th Street. They would like to know the people in the actual houses are in support. And if there are issues around that, they also want to know that the community wants it to happen. I think it takes a certain redrawing of people's mental ideas, that people think in terms of Brooklyn as the abolitionist capital, or Lower Manhattan. And it doesn't mean that it's not if it's up here. Just because you didn't know it doesn't mean that it isn't. And I think it's sort of owning a sort of being willing to revise how different parts of the island are thought about.
Michael, the other thing you mentioned that struck me is this idea of the transitional nature of the period that we're talking about. The fact that this area of the city was once dominated by the Audubons and the folks at the Morris Jamel Mansion, people who were slaveholders who had a certain vision of the world and the city and the burgeoning nation. And in comes slowly this trickle of folks from downtown who have different ideas. And this slow shift of viewpoint is, in a way, sort of really nicely exemplified in this particular house, at least 857 Riverside, which is a Greek Revival Italianate style house, which in itself shows the transition of two architectural periods. They right around the 1850s, and you certainly know way more about this. You told me all about it for the report that we submitted. But at this time in the 1850s, architects were moving away from the Greek Revival style, and people were building the Italianate villas that used to dominate the area around Audubon Park. But in and of itself, that shows this nature of transition within the architecture. It tells this idea of transition within the mindset of the people who were here. It reflects the transition that New York is always going through. So I find, yes, I know that there have been some people who say, well, you can just put up a plaque somewhere and put Dennis Harris and John Newhouse's name on it and tell a little story. But it seems to me that this house and the transitional nature of the look of it is the best way to sort of exemplify the way New York and our world around us is always changing. And I think at such a lousy time in our lives right now that we need that kind of hope. We need that kind of hope to remind us that things change and things slowly get better. That's
well, the part of the answer to that, Joseph, is that, the Landmarks Preservation Commission, in their response to that house, they act as if we don't have every intention of seeing to it that house is restored to its original glory. We're going to work and do our darndest to make that occur. And in the piece that John Gill wrote, the man who was contesting that, the occupant, the man who was contesting that he was bamboozled out of his property, he says that if he can get it back, the control of this property back from the developer, that he's a builder and that he's going to restore all those original elements. And we're here to say that if we can get the place landmarked, that we will see to it that whoever owns it, it will be restored to its original appearance.
It's also, you know, when they read the request for examination that Joe wrote, one of the things they said in their letter was kind of really interesting idea, that thing about abolitionists up there, but not the right specimen. It's like, we're going to go look for a better house that belonged to abolitionists now that we accept that they were out there. But what if there aren't others? I mean, is that a reason to knock this one down, go on a field trip, look to see if there are other similar houses and decide they're not, and let this idea go by the wayside? If you don't, I mean, landmarking by its very nature takes years, but if you don't leap in some way, it will go by. It won't be there anymore. And it seems like you have to possibly move with more speed, and it's just criminal to let things, you know, go by the wayside.
This house and the houses on Sylvan Terrace, which are somewhat later, they're miracles of survival, that they managed to last throughout all the vicissitudes of time and change, and they're made of wood. You know, wooden houses were outlawed in Manhattan proper in 1874 because they were so prone to be burned, and so it's a miracle that this house has survived. And beyond telling us about the history of architecture and the history of development, this particular house tells us something about the history of politics and the political contest between pro-slavers and abolitionists that existed right here in our city. And so the few remnants we have of this history, of course, should be preserved. And if you want to talk about, well, they've changed, well, guess what? Whatever's been changed, particularly in a city as glorious as New York, can be changed back. And Sylvan Terrace is the perfect example. Nadal, if you'll show the first slides, please.
You might want to say where it is, because I think a lot of people don't know where Sylvan Terrace is.
Well, I'm just about to say that it was built along the carriage drive of the Morris Jamel Mansion, one of the most architecturally impressive houses ever created on Manhattan Island, that is up above Yankee Stadium, near Amsterdam Avenue, between 160th and 162nd Streets. This was the screened archway of the carriage entrance. And here you see the houses in the next slide, which were built there after Madame Jamel died in the 1860s. Her estate was terribly encumbered with heirs who had been unknown to her, claiming a right to her estate. And so it was in limbo for a long time. So her rightful heirs wanted to make some cash very quickly, and they erected these houses for working class people. And over the years, these houses, which were all identical, slowly but surely were changed one by one, and covered in aluminum siding and asphalt siding and permastone, just like the Harris house. And they were changed so dramatically that when the Landmarks Preservation Commission looked at them and then finally decided to designate them in 1981, they gave a grant of HUD funding to each individual homeowner to restore facades which had been changed, so that you can see in this next slide how, and this slide, and then in the next slide, how one house might have a stucco front, the next house have aluminum siding, the hoods be removed from the doors of one house, the stoop removed from the entrance of another house. All of these houses were made quite dissimilar, and the Landmarks Preservation Commission, with designation, used designation as a vehicle by which to effect the restoration of these houses. And in doing so, gave a wonderful gift to the city and showed how landmarking is not the end all and be all. It is just one tool amongst many that we must utilize in New York in order to be able to tell the story of all of the diverse people of every class and race who have through their efforts together, made New York into the greatest city in the world. And this is what I hope we are going to be able to do, is to get the commission to designate these houses and then to be able to bring about their restoration in an authentic way that will tell the full story of the full history of what Audubon Park was. Now, before we go on to opening up the floor for questions from the audience, I just wanted to publicly thank Harlem One Stop, which is really the creature and creation of our hostess, Miss Yuen Chin, whose birthday is today. And so I would just like to say, happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Yuen. Happy birthday to you. Now,
Bravo, Michael.
do any of
Very
you,
nice, very nice.
are any of you better at reading these questions than I am? Because I'm just doing this from my phone, so I can't, I'm finding it really hard to.
I've been following some of them, Michael, and there's several questions that have to do with just the process of how would you go about restoring the house, having a foundation of some sort of 501c3, for example, that would run it, would advertise for school programs, manage it, that sort of thing. I think all of that is stuff that we would need to think of. But at the moment, the immediate concern is making sure that it's there so that we can take those next steps.
One thing about Sylvan Terrace, which leads into this, people are asking, well, how can we do the museum? Maybe you don't need to do the museum. Sylvan Terrace is fully occupied now. It's not a museum, it's residential. And there could be people living in 857 who love it as it is and restore it while living there. And you don't have to have school groups or worry about who's organizing what. There are different ways to look at a landmark property. And in fact, the neighborhood that we live in has become more valuable because it's landmarked. It has an
Oh, golly,
identity.
you know, an abolitionist museum in Audubon Park, that would be a wonderful thing. But as you suggest, it's not imperative that that happen. And the way it happens, that this house is interpreted and used in the future, that's in the future. The immediate problem is to keep it from being destroyed. And so I suggest to all of you in the audience who are concerned as we are, please call and email the mayor of the city of New York and the Landmarks Preservation Commission of the city of New York. And I tell you, they really do respond to being contacted by the public. And this is something that you can do that really will make an imperative difference. You may not imagine that it could be that significant, but it is. It's very, very important. So please, please, I beseech you, contact the Landmarks Preservation Commission and the mayor of the city of New York and say that we want our history fully preserved in Audubon Park.
It's true. If there are folks out there who are suffering under the misperception that politicians don't listen, they really do. As a journalist, I don't cover politics a whole heck of a lot, but I have had dealings with political offices in the past, and I've heard the same thing over and over, which is that they actually really do eagerly count the number of calls they get, the number of emails they get with regard to any particular issue. And when they see the numbers going up regarding a certain idea, they pay attention to that because they want to know what is on the minds of their constituents. So that is definitely something worth doing, sending an email, or as I've mentioned before, if it's easier to just for you to put your name down on a list, then stoptower857.org is another option. But people really do pay attention to the numbers. They really do hear you.
And you're their electors anyway. I mean, they are in theory supposed to do what you ask for, but if you don't ask for anything, you're not going to get it. You really have to reach out as a citizen, not just as activists.
Again, I think, people who are interested in this issue can contact your group, Vivian. How do they email you?
Well, they can always email me, but it's stoptower857.org. And there's a lot of history on, you can recap a lot of today, and you can sign a petition there. We should probably put it up on the screen. Maybe we should put it up on the chat for people to see as something that they should, where they can sign a petition, where they can learn more about it, where we can organize for people to do things. So there's a Facebook page, there's a 501c3 type, we're a nonprofit actually, and we are hosts through the Historic Districts Council. We're using their nonprofit as our fiscal conduit. If you feel the need to contribute to our cause, which you can get a tax write-off and support the work that we're doing, which is another positive thing that would really help us besides letters. I'm sure that you and Harlem One Stop will be happy to connect you to us, and we would be happy to email with you and help direct you if there isn't enough information here.
And Matthew, I see a note here from someone asking how can they get a copy of your incredible book to learn more about Audubon Park.
Well, thank you. I was
Start lining up.
Yeah, right. You can order it directly from the publisher, which is Fordham University Press. It's also available from Barnes & Noble, Amazon, the regular sort of online book dealers, or ask at your local bookstore. Yes, Word Up.
Exactly. Word Up, our local community bookstore is selling it.
Yes.
And they're signed, aren't they?
I'm not sure if the ones at Word Up are, but I'll be happy to.
You could make it.
Definitely. Thank you for asking.
And it's a great read. It really is. It's packed full of fascinating details about this section of the city that I'd never known about, and it's such an enjoyable read as well. So kudos to you, Matthew.
Yes, thank you very much.
Is there anything else?
Any other audience questions?
Well, there was one thing I wanted to say, and that is, Vivian, the reason why I put it to you as proposal of a candidates forum is because were we to have a candidates forum with all of the candidates for mayor and all the candidates for Manhattan Borough President and all of the candidates to represent the area in the city council, were we to do that, we would get people speaking on the record in public, where they wouldn't be able to, weasel out of whatever they might have to say. And also, I have found in the past that can sometimes act as a challenge for people to up the ante and do better than their opponents in terms of offering their support.
But aren't all these forums coming? I mean, a new mayoral election, a borough president election, and there will be debates and there will be forums in a way. And to some degree, we're educating a public to come and speak out on this issue, as opposed to some of the many other issues, that this matters too.
What I'm saying is that if your group there in the Oval were to sponsor such a panel with, say, the community board or whomever, that you could have it instead of, there's so many issues confronting all New Yorkers, to have a forum devoted specifically to historic preservation in Upper Manhattan, so that I can think that Valerie Bradley at Save Harlem Now might want to be involved in co-sponsoring something like that.
But I think in the end, we have local support, and they've done a lot for us. there's the far end of this, landmarks and the mayor's office, that really are the people who need to be convinced. Our local representatives are very convinced. So
Well, as I'm saying, I'm not just talking about local people. I'm talking about the mayoral candidate,
right.
the borough presidential candidates, and
Right.
moreover, aren't you going to get a new city council representative? It's not going to be the same person. There's going to be someone else, and you want to have them on record and on the dotted line that they support your issue.
This is true, and the new mayor and the new borough president. We want them on our side, and we will work for that. But we need your signatures to help us with this, and for you to show up to those events when they happen. Not you, Michael, everybody else.
Well, I hope I get to come.
You can come.
Oh, thank you. I'm afraid that this lull suggests that in the fullness of time, we have come to our close. Although I just saw another question flash up, but I have a difficulty reading these questions. If some of you else, the rest of you could read them, I would be appreciative, because I'm not see. I just see that a question comes up and then it's gone.
A lot of the questions, Michael, one audience member will pose and another is answering. So I think that we've gotten a lot of them answered, and I believe we'll have a record of the questions that we can do follow up later individually, if appropriate.
And we have your email, or Harlem One Stop presumably has your email addresses, which would be useful to us if you want to hear further about what we were discussing and how you can make a difference.
Looks like we are at 5:30. Is that our bewitching hour?
That in this case, this is our bewitching hour, and I thank you all very much for your participation and for all of your dedicated hard work in helping to improve this part of our city in Upper Manhattan through your preservation advocacy. Thank you very, very much. And I hope that all of you will stay tuned for the next offering of Hidden in Plain Sight, these virtual salons of Harlem One Stop, which are brought to you by this wonderful group, Harlem One Stop, which is really the cultural spotlight of Upper Manhattan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Really, this was